Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something pretty fascinating, something that's foundational to a lot of Western political thought, the Athenian Constitution.
Yes. A cornerstone of democracy, you might say.
Exactly. And we're lucky enough to have a pretty amazing guide for this deep dive. Aristotle's work, the Athenian Constitution, it's chock full of insights and some pretty wild stories about Athenian history. We're talking exiles, tyrants, power struggles, the whole nine yards.
It's a real roller coaster ride of a journey, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more fascinating is that the Athenians weren't just passive players in their own history.
Right. They were constantly shaping and reshaping their system of government. They were experimenting, adapting, and always looking for ways to, well, get it right.
Exactly. They were pioneers, really, in the idea of self-governance, and their successes and failures have a lot to teach us, even today.
So let's rewind the clock all the way back to the early days of Athens. Aristotle tells us that it wasn't always a democracy. It started as an oligarchy, which might sound a bit unfamiliar to some folks.
Oligarchy. Think of it like this. A small group of wealthy, powerful individuals hold all the reins. They control the government, they control the resources, and everyone else basically has to, go along for the ride.
Yeah, not exactly a system that promotes equality or fairness.
No, not quite. And in early Athens, this meant that a handful of wealthy landowners called the shots. They were the elite, and everyone else, particularly the poorest class known as the polate or hectomore, were essentially serfs, bound to the land.
And to make matters even worse, there was this brutal system of debt slavery.
Yes, debt slavery. A truly horrific practice where if you couldn't pay your debts, your entire family could be enslaved, forced to work for those who held your debt. It was a system that trapped people in a cycle of poverty and exploitation.
It's just hard to fathom that such a system could exist. It's no wonder there was so much tension and unrest in Athenian society.
Absolutely. The gap between the rich and the poor was vast, and the system was rigged against the average person. It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And that's where Draco enters the scene, right? Famous for his harsh laws, the so-called draconian laws.
Yes, Draco. He's become almost synonymous with severity and punishment. But in a way, he was also a reformer.
A reformer? How so?
Well, before Draco, Athenian law was unwritten and often arbitrary, leaving a lot of room for abuse and injustice.
So Draco's big contribution was to actually write down the laws, to codify them.
Exactly. He created the first real code of laws in Athens, bringing a degree of order and consistency to the legal system.
But I guess those laws were still pretty harsh, right? Hence the term draconian.
Yeah, they were known for their severity. For instance, the penalty for even minor offenses could be death. It seems pretty extreme to us today, but in their context, it was about establishing clear consequences and deterring crime in a society that was, well, pretty chaotic.
And of course, those laws didn't exactly address the root of the problem, the huge imbalance of power between the rich and the poor.
No, not at all. Voting rights were still tied to military equipment, which meant that if you couldn't afford armor and weapons, you couldn't vote. It essentially excluded the poorest citizens from any real political participation.
So while Draco brought some order to the legal system, he didn't really move the needle on democracy.
Not really.
Yeah.
And to make things even more complex, there was another powerful player in Athenian politics, the Council of Areopagus.
Ah, yes, the Areopagus. They sound pretty intimidating. Who were they exactly?
Imagine a council made up of former archons, highest officials in Athens. And not just any former archons, these were the elite, the most powerful and influential men in Athenian society.
So a council of elder statesmen, essentially.
You could say that. They served for life and had immense authority, especially in matters of law and governance. They were a force to be reckoned with.
It sounds like they were a bit like a Supreme Court, but with even more power.
In a way, yes. And in a society where wealth and family connections were everything, the Areopagus was a bastion of tradition and privilege.
So we've got this entrenched oligarchy, a harsh legal system, and a powerful council of elites. It all seems pretty stacked against the average Athenian. How did they ever manage to break free from this system and create a democracy?
Well, it wasn't easy, that's for sure. It took a series of crises, reforms, and some pretty remarkable individuals to push Athenian society toward a more democratic system.
And that's where Solon comes in, right? He's often hailed as the father of Athenian democracy. What made him so different from those who came before him?
Solon was a fascinating figure. He was a poet, a lawmaker, and a man who was deeply respected for his wisdom and fairness. The Athenians, facing growing social unrest and the threat of civil war, turned to him to mediate between the warring factions and find a way out of the crisis.
And he didn't just tweak the system around the edges, did he? He made some pretty radical changes.
He did. He understood that to save Athenian society, he needed to address the root causes of the unrest, the poverty, the inequality, and the crushing burden of debt that was weighing down so many Athenians.
And that's where his famous debt cancellation comes in, right? The Sysakadia, as it's called.
Exactly. The Sysakadia, which means shaking off of burdens, was a revolutionary move. Solon abolished debt slavery entirely. No more families torn apart and sold because of debt. He even canceled all existing debts, both public and private.
Wow, that's huge. It's like hitting the reset button on the entire Athenian economy. It must have been incredibly controversial.
It was. Imagine the wealthy landowners, those who had profited from the system. They were furious. But Solon saw it as a necessary step to restore balance and prevent a full-blown civil war.
It sounds like he could have seized absolute power at that point. He had the support of the people, and the old elites were weakened.
That's what makes Solon even more remarkable. He could have easily become a tyrant, but he chose not to. He believed in the rule of law and the importance of creating a system that would serve the interests of all Athenians, not just the privileged few.
So instead of becoming a dictator, he created a new constitution for Athens. But did that constitution establish a true democracy?
Well, not entirely. It was a step in the right direction, but it was still a system with its limitations. Solon's constitution divided citizens into 4 classes based on their wealth: the Pentecosimedimni, the Knights, the Zeugetae, and the Thetes.
4 classes of citizens, so it was still a hierarchy, but based on wealth rather than birth or lineage.
Exactly. The wealthiest class, the Pentecosimedimni, held the most power, but there was a crucial difference this time. Even the Thetes, the poorest class, were given the right to participate in the assembly and serve on juries.
So while there was still a hierarchy, there was at least a path for even the poorest citizens to have their voices heard. It wasn't a full-blown democracy, but it was a step in that direction.
It was a compromise, really, a way to balance the interests of the different classes and create a more stable and just society.
And Solon himself defended this system, didn't he?
He did. There's a famous quote from him where he describes himself standing with his shield outstretched, protecting both the rich and the poor from each other. He saw his role as finding that delicate balance, ensuring that neither side could completely dominate the other.
That's such a powerful image. It's a reminder that building a just society often requires finding that middle ground, that compromise between competing interests.
Absolutely. But as we know, Athenian history was never simple. There were always new challenges, new power struggles, and new figures who had emerged to shape the course of their democracy.
And speaking of new figures, that brings us to Pisistratus, a man who we usually associate with the word tyrant. But his story, as with so much of Athenian history, is much more complex than it might seem at first glance.
Oh, Pisistratus. He's a fascinating character, full of contradictions and unexpected twists. He's a reminder that labels like tyrant don't always tell the whole story.
So let's unravel the story of Pisistratus, the so-called tyrant of Athens. How did he rise to power, and what made his rule so different from those who came before him?
Well, his rise to power was anything but conventional. It involved cunning, ambition, and, well, a bit of self-inflicted drama.
Self-inflicted drama? What do you mean?
It all started with a wound that Pisistratus, inflicted upon himself.
He injured himself on purpose. Why on earth would he do that?
It was a calculated, albeit dramatic, ploy to gain sympathy and secure a bodyguard, which he then used to seize the Acropolis, the heart of Athens. It was a bold power move, and it worked.
That's quite a story. So he used a self-inflicted wound to grab power and declare himself a tyrant. It's not exactly the image that comes to mind when we think of benevolent leaders.
But here's the twist. Despite being called a tyrant, Pisistratus' rule was surprisingly moderate.
Moderate? How so? I thought tyrants were supposed to be, tyrannical.
That's the common perception. But Pisistratus didn't fit the mold. He prioritized peace and stability, he helped the poor, and he largely upheld the existing laws and institutions. Some even describe his rule as benevolent.
So he was a tyrant who acted more like a just and fair ruler.
It seems paradoxical, but yes, it's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. Even those who seize power in unconventional ways can sometimes govern with wisdom and restraint.
It makes you wonder how different Athenian history might have been if Pisistratus' sons had inherited those qualities.
It does, doesn't it? Unfortunately, his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, lacked their father's moderation, and their actions eventually led to the downfall of their dynasty and paved the way for another pivotal chapter in the development of Athenian democracy.
That's the thing about history, isn't it? There's always another chapter, another twist, another unexpected turn of events. And that brings us to the Alcmaeonidae family, who played a key role in driving out the tyrants and ushering in a new era of reform.
The Alcmaeonidae were a powerful and ambitious family, and from their ranks emerged a leader who would leave an indelible mark on Athenian democracy: Cleisthenes.
Cleisthenes, the man who is often credited with laying the foundations for the Athenian democracy that we know from history books. What were his key contributions? How did he reshape Athenian society?
Well, Cleisthenes was a shrewd politician and a visionary reformer. He understood that to prevent the return of tyranny and create a truly stable democracy, he needed to break up the old power structures and create a system that was more inclusive and representative.
It sounds like he was thinking big, not just trying to patch up the existing system. What were some of the specific reforms he implemented?
His most significant move was creating 10 new tribes, a brilliant way to break up old loyalties and power bases that were rooted in family ties and geographic location. He essentially reshuffled Athenian society, creating new units of citizenship that cut across traditional lines of division.
So instead of being tied to your family or your neighborhood, you were now part of this new tribe, a new community of citizens. It was a way to foster a sense of shared identity and create a more unified Athenian state. That's pretty clever.
It was. He was a master of political engineering.
Hmm.
And he didn't stop there. He also introduced a system that still fascinates us today: ostracism.
Ostracism, the idea that citizens could vote to exile someone deemed too powerful or dangerous. It sounds almost like a democratic safety valve, a way to prevent anyone from becoming too dominant.
Exactly. It was a unique feature of Athenian democracy, a way to safeguard against the rise of another tyrant. If a citizen was deemed a threat to the stability of the state, they could be voted into exile for 10 years. It was a powerful tool, but as with any tool, it could be used for good or ill.
It's fascinating how they tried to build these safeguards into their system, these mechanisms to prevent the abuse of power and protect their democracy. But as we know, the story of Athenian democracy is far from over. There were more challenges, more conflicts, and more reforms to come.
Oh yes, their journey was just beginning. They would face wars, internal strife, and even temporary lapses back into oligarchy. But through it all, they would cling to the idea of self-governance, constantly striving to create a more just and equitable society.
So join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the Athenian Constitution. We'll explore the golden age of Athenian democracy, the devastating impact of the Peloponnesian War, and the remarkable resilience of a people determined to govern themselves. It's a story that has a lot to teach us about the challenges and the possibilities of democracy, both in ancient Athens and in our own world today. When we left off last time, Cleisthenes had just reshaped Athenian society with his reforms, setting the stage for what we now call the Golden Age of Athens. It's a period of incredible cultural flourishing, but as we know, history is rarely a smooth ride. This era also lays the groundwork for that epic clash with Sparta, the Peloponnesian War.
It's true. The Golden Age was a time of great achievement for Athens, but those achievements also brought new challenges and tensions.
Right, like leading the Delian League, that alliance of Greek city-states against the Persians. All that power and influence must have had some ripple effects.
Absolutely. It actually led to a bit of a resurgence, you might say, in the authority of the Council of Areopagus.
Wait, didn't we talk about Ephialtes stripping the Areopagus of their power? Why were they suddenly back in the picture?
Well, remember, after the trauma of the Persian Wars, there was this sense that experience and stability were paramount. People looked to the Areopagus, with all its history and aristocratic roots, for guidance. It's almost like a societal reflex, to lean on tradition when things feel uncertain.
It makes sense. When you're facing a crisis, you kind of want something familiar to hold on to, even if it's not perfect. But this conservative shift didn't last forever, did it? The Athenians weren't about to give up on their hard-won democratic reforms that easily.
You're absolutely right. The spirit of Athenian democracy was burning bright, and a new generation of leaders emerged, determined to make sure the Areopagus didn't regain its former dominance. And one of these figures was Ephialtes.
Ephialtes. Sadly, Aristotle mentions that he was assassinated. But before that, he played a key role in limiting the power of the Areopagus, didn't he?
He did. He was a true champion of the people. He led a movement that redistributed much of the Areopagus' authority to those more democratic institutions, the Council of 500, the Assembly, and the law courts.
Those three institutions become pretty central to Athenian governance, don't they? Let's break them down a bit. What was this Council of 500?
Think of the Council of 500, also known as the Boule, like a steering committee for the Athenian democracy. They were responsible for preparing legislation, setting the agenda for the assembly. It was a lot of work, keeping things organized and making sure the wheels of government kept turning.
So the Council of 500 did the groundwork, the behind-the-scenes stuff, and then the assembly was where the real action happened.
Precisely. The assembly was the heart and soul of Athenian democracy. All citizens, regardless of their wealth or social standing, could participate, debate, and vote on laws. It was direct democracy in action, a truly remarkable sight to behold.
It must have been pretty chaotic at times, with hundreds of people all trying to have their say.
Oh, I'm sure it was. But that was the beauty of it, too. Everyone had a voice. Everyone had a stake in how their city was run.
And then there were the law courts. Aristotle really goes into detail about how they work, doesn't he?
He does, and it's fascinating stuff. Their legal system was truly unique. It was built around the idea of citizen juries, which meant that ordinary Athenians, not just professional judges, were responsible for deciding legal cases.
So it wasn't just about voting for laws, it was about being actively involved in the justice system, too.
Exactly. It was a cornerstone of Athenian democracy, a way to ensure that justice was truly in the hands of the people. Of course, no system is perfect, and there were challenges and debates about how best to select jurors, how to ensure fairness, and all that.
Right. It's a debate that continues to this day in our own legal systems. But this period also sees the rise of, well, one of the most famous figures in Athenian history, Pericles.
Pericles. He was more than just a leader. He was a visionary, a brilliant orator, a skilled strategist. He's often seen as the embodiment of the Athenian Golden Age, a time of incredible cultural and political achievement.
He was the one who really pushed Athens to focus on its naval power, wasn't he? He saw that the future of Athens lay at sea.
Exactly. He understood that controlling the seas was crucial for their trade, their defense, and their influence in the region. And he wasn't afraid to make bold decisions, like, introducing pay for jury duty.
Pay for jury duty. Now that's interesting. It seems like a double-edged sword, doesn't it?
It does. On one hand, it made the system more accessible, allowing even the poorest citizens to participate. But it also raised concerns about potential abuse, with people serving on juries simply for the money, not out of a sense of civic duty.
It's a debate that's still relevant today, isn't it? Does incentivizing civic participation ultimately strengthen or weaken democracy?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. But it shows that Pericles was willing to think outside the box, to experiment, to try new things in order to make Athenian democracy function better.
But even under the leadership of a figure like Pericles, Athenian democracy was about to face its biggest test yet, the Peloponnesian War. That long and brutal conflict with Sparta that would ultimately change the course of Athenian history.
The Peloponnesian War was a turning point, a time of immense upheaval and change. It tested the limits of Athenian democracy, exposed its vulnerabilities, and ultimately led to a period of instability and uncertainty.
And after Pericles died from the plague, it seems like Athenian politics became even more volatile.
It did. The war created this atmosphere of fear and anxiety, and figures like Cleon, who was known for his fiery rhetoric and his appeals to the people's emotions, gained influence.
Aristotle describes Cleon as quite a contrast to Pericles. He was much more brash and aggressive, wasn't he?
He was. He wasn't afraid to stir up controversy or appeal to people's baser instincts. He was a populist, and he knew how to play to the crowd. And in a time of war, when people are looking for someone to blame, someone to offer simple solutions, that kind of rhetoric can be very powerful.
It sounds like a bit of a warning, doesn't it, about how even the most well-established democracies can be vulnerable to demagogues, especially in times of crisis. And things got even more chaotic, didn't they, with attempts to establish oligarchies, like that short-lived Council of 400.
Yes, the desperation of war led to some drastic measures. Some people believed that concentrating power in the hands of a few would bring stability and perhaps even curry favor with the Persians who were backing Sparta. They thought maybe an oligarchy could negotiate a better peace deal.
So they were willing to abandon their democracy, at least temporarily, in the hope of winning the war.
It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to turn the tide. But it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, the Council of 400 didn't last very long, did they? The Athenians weren't about to give up on their self-governance that easily.
They weren't. They overthrew the 400 and restored a form of democracy, albeit a more restricted one, with greater emphasis on military qualifications for citizenship. It was known as the Rule of the 5,000.
So even in the midst of a war that was tearing their society apart, the Athenians still clung to the idea of self-government. But sadly, as we know, the war would end in tragedy for Athens.
It did. The defeat at Aegospotami was a devastating blow. They lost their entire fleet to the Spartans, a loss from which they would never recover. It marked the end of their dominance in the Aegean and led to their surrender to Sparta.
A crushing defeat. And it led to one of the darkest chapters in Athenian history, the rule of the 30 tyrants. That name alone sends chills down my spine.
It's a chilling reminder of how quickly hard-won liberties can be lost, how easily a society can descend into tyranny, even one that prided itself on its democratic traditions.
What was it like for the average Athenian living under the rule of the 30?
Imagine living in a climate of fear and repression, where the freedoms you once cherished are brutally suppressed. The 30 tyrants, this oligarchic regime imposed by Sparta, systematically dismantled the institutions of Athenian democracy. They executed and banished their opponents, confiscated property, and ruled with an iron fist.
But even in those dark times, the spirit of resistance flickered. Tell us about Thrasybulus and that incredible movement to overthrow the 30.
It was a dark time, no doubt about it. But even facing this brutal regime, the Athenian spirit wasn't completely crushed. There were those who refused to accept this tyranny.
Like Thrasybulus, the Athenian general who escaped the city and became a symbol of resistance.
Yes, Thrasybulus and a small band of exiles. They captured a fortress just north of Athens, Phyle, and from there they launched these daring raids against the 30. It was a real David and Goliath situation, a tiny force taking on this powerful, oppressive regime.
They were incredibly brave. Did they really believe they could win against such odds?
It must have seemed like an impossible task, but they were driven by this deep belief in Athenian democracy, this fierce determination to free their city from oppression. And they also knew that the 30, despite their brutality, had made a lot of enemies.
Ah, so the 30 tyrants, even though they were ruthless, they weren't very good at making friends?
Not exactly. They alienated a lot of people with their excesses and their cruelty. Even some who had initially supported them started to have second thoughts. They realized that the 30 had gone too far, that they were a threat to the very fabric of Athenian society.
So it was a combination of factors, really. The courage of the resistance, the mistakes of the tyrants, and the growing discontent among the Athenian people.
Absolutely. And in the end, against all odds, Thrasybulus and his followers, with the support of the Athenian people, managed to drive out the 30 and restore democracy to Athens. It's a truly amazing story of resilience, a testament to the power of hope and the human spirit's refusal to be crushed by tyranny.
It's a really inspiring story, isn't it? But I imagine that after such a traumatic experience, Athenian society was deeply divided and scarred. How did they manage to move forward after such a brutal chapter in their history?
It was a critical moment. The restored democracy had this huge task ahead of them. They had to deal with the legacy of the 30 tyrants, heal the wounds of the past, and find a way to rebuild their city and their society.
It would have been understandable if they had sought revenge, if they had wanted to punish those who had collaborated with the tyrants.
I think that's what many people expected. They thought there would be mass trials, executions, a purge of those who had sided with the 30. But the Athenians chose a different path. They chose reconciliation.
Reconciliation. They actually forgave those who had betrayed their city.
It's remarkable, isn't it? Instead of seeking retribution, they offered amnesty to most of those who collaborated with the 30. They only excluded the most brutal leaders from this amnesty.
That's an incredible act of forgiveness. It must have been so difficult, especially for those who had suffered so much under the tyranny. What motivated them to choose this path of reconciliation?
I think they realized that a cycle of vengeance would only lead to more violence and division. They understood that to rebuild their shattered city, they needed to find a way to heal the wounds of the past and move forward together. And they even went a step further. They actually repaid the debts that the kami had incurred.
They repaid the debts of the tyrants. Why would they do that?
It was a gesture of goodwill, a way to show that they were truly committed to reconciliation, to starting fresh. They weren't obligated to do it under the peace treaty with Sparta, but they did it anyway. It was a sign of their strength, their maturity as a democracy.
It's an amazing example of how a society can choose to break free from the cycle of violence and revenge. But not everyone was on board with this reconciliation, right? Aristotle mentions this group that seceded from Athens and settled in Eleusis. They weren't exactly thrilled about the amnesty offered to the collaborators, were they?
The secessionists at Eleusis. Yes, you're right. They represented a faction that had lost faith in the Athenian system. They were deeply skeptical of the amnesty. They feared that the restored democracy would be unstable, that it would be vulnerable to further upheaval. They just didn't trust those who had collaborated with the 30, and they wanted nothing to do with the new government.
So, even after everything they had been through, Athenian society was still deeply divided. How did the government respond to these secessionists? Did they try to force them back into the fold?
You know, they could have. They had the military power to do it.
Hmm.
But they chose a different approach. They chose dialogue. They chose negotiation. They tried to understand the fears and concerns of the secessionists to assure them that the restored democracy was committed to justice and stability.
It was a gamble, wasn't it, to trust that these secessionists would eventually come around?
It was. But it was a gamble that paid off. Eventually, seeing that the restored democracy was genuinely committed to reconciliation, seeing that their concerns were being heard, the secessionists at Eleusis agreed to rejoin the Athenian state. It's a testament to the power of dialogue, the importance of building trust, even in the wake of deep political divisions.
So after a period of extraordinary turbulence, tyranny, war, internal conflict, Athenian democracy had been restored and perhaps even strengthened. The constitution that Aristotle describes in such detail, the one we've been exploring in this deep dive, is the culmination of this long and arduous journey.
It's a constitution shaped by both triumph and tragedy. It reflects the lessons they learned, the mistakes they made, and their unwavering belief in the power of self-governance.
And it's a story that has so much to teach us even today about the fragility of democracy, the importance of civic engagement, and the enduring power of hope and reconciliation. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Athenian Constitution. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we have.
And we hope it inspires you to think critically about your own role in shaping the future of democracy, wherever you are in the world.
Until next time, keep those Athenian lessons in mind, and remember that the fate of democracy rests in our hands.